So today, again, we have the Muslim apologetic, but this time he's debated Bob at Speaker's Corner. Just came across this video, and it was relevant because he's talking about relative identity and other stuff in logic, and he's just completely misconstruing it. So let's go through it bit by bit.
I love you, Sam.
Each person is fully G-ish, aka possesses the divine essence, and they deny each other, right? So when it comes to using the classical counting method, apply Leibniz's law, aka, do you accept transitivity? That if A equals B and B equals C, then A is C?
Yes.
Okay, if the Father is God and the Son is God, on the transitivity, tell me how that wouldn't entail modalism, aka that the Father is just the Son, simpliciter, because you believe that the Father is the divine essence, is the divine essence, and the Son is the divine essence, and yet they know each other.
So the first thing he asked Bob is if he holds to transitivity. Now, I don't know what that means. I think what he's trying to ask is whether or not Bob thinks transitivity is a property of identity, which it is. That's not disputed upon. Bob says yes. Bob doesn't know anything about logic. Obviously, he doesn't study it, formal logic at least. And so he goes on to say that if the Father is fully G-ish and the Son is fully G-ish, tell me how that doesn't entail modalism. Now, this is a very common confusion. People think that just because you say is, that somehow that forces you into a certain formalization using the identity operator. It does not. As you heard, or as you may have heard many philosophers say, there's an is of predication and there's an is of identity, which are the two most common options that they're translated into. And you can use is informally and not be forced to translate it into any formal language in any way, right? Because nothing about using and or forces you into formalizing it by saying conjunction or disjunction. Is does not force you to formalize it into identity. Even if we say the Father is identical to the divine essence, is identical to could be a predicate, right? You can define a predicate as anything. So it's just a confusion, but I mean, it's a very common one. But it's very important to understand that just by using the word is does not force you into identity or the identity operator, formalizing that statement with the identity operator like he's implying here.
Readings, that's fine, we can go on that, it's no issue. So now, the question to you is, if you accept, you said you accept Leibniz's law, which means you accept transitivity, what is the argument that the Father isn't going to collapse into just being equal to the Son if you accept transitivity?
Okay, so
Okay, we're at 8 minutes in, and he says, if you accept Leibniz's law, that means you accept transitivity. That's true, because Leibniz's law uses the identity operator. And then he says, if you accept transitivity, show me how it's not going to fall into modalism. That seems very weird to say, because just because someone accepts certain logical notations in their language doesn't mean that they're using them to formalize anything, right? I can formalize the Trinity without appealing to the identity operator at all, hypothetically, or I could formalize it using the identity operator. But saying that someone accepts something as an axiom in their system or accepts a certain definition of a certain whatever identity or a certain logical structure of identity doesn't mean they're using it when they're formalizing or modeling something or a certain set of statements about the Trinity. Does not mean that, right? You don't use identity when you say Allah is merciful, right? You use a predicate because it would collapse mercy into his being loving, so mercy and loving are identical, and they don't want to say that. So it doesn't accurately capture the set of statements, so you don't formalize it like that. But that doesn't mean they don't reject absolute identity. That doesn't mean they don't reject transitivity, even though if you did formalize it like that, it would force it to be transitive, and it would force creator and loving, or loving and merciful, to collapse into being the same thing, which they say they're not. So he's just confused. And so the main point is that you got to understand that there's a difference between having an axiom in your language, having certain definitions of variables and operators in your language, and actively using them to model something, right? Because we have all types of things in our language that we don't use every time we model something. That applies to everybody.
One God.
Right.
The argument for that is going to be that if you accept transitivity and you accept classical counting methods, under that, if there's going to be three things that are both predicated, all three predicated with gods and on each other, under CCM is going to entail polytheism. I'll give you an example.
Use the Quran.
Just give me a second. You have to tell me my argument.
Use the Quran.
No, I don't have to. Me, Bob, and let's say a third person, although we all share the same essence, aka the set of essential properties, and I'm going to get you to hash out your definition of essence right now. Although we share the same essence, he would agree that mono-humanity wouldn't entail. What is mono-humanity? They believe that all 8 billion people, although the 8 billion people is just one human being. So, if he believes that he can hold transitivity and CCM, he's going to have to give me the symmetry breaker between there being three persons, and although they share the same essence and have different properties, that wouldn't entail mono-humanity in relation to how he believes that there's going to be three persons that are all one God, although they share different properties. What is the symmetry breaker, Bob? Please answer that directly.
Okay.
So, in this next clip, he says, if you accept transitivity and accept CCM, under that, if there are three things both predicated of God and they are not each other, under CCM, it's going to entail polytheism. And he says, here's an example that supports his claim, or his argument, as he calls it, even though that's not an argument. He says, me, Bob, and a third person, although we share the same essence, aka set of essential properties, it wouldn't entail that all 8 billion people are just one human being. So first of all, as Catholics, I don't know how many of you Catholics, or Thomists, or anyone who's Aristotelian, like in their metaphysics, would disagree that an essence is a set of essential properties. That's not what an essence is, and classical Islamic metaphysics also disagrees with that, so I don't know why he's saying that. That aside, I have no clue why he's bringing up transitivity here, because transitivity is a property of identity, of logical identity, in this case that he's trying to bring it up. So he's trying to act as if he's giving some formalization that logically entails polytheism, but he's not doing that, because in his support, or his example, which is supposed to be support for his claim, he's trying to say that there needs to be some symmetry breaker between how, when we say there's the kind of thing, which is a human, and I count 3 people, that means there's 3 humans. But when I say there's the kind of thing that is God, but then I count 3 persons, there isn't 3 gods. Now, it's a fair question to ask, the second question, but it has nothing to do with logic. And when he talks about classical counting method, I have no clue what he's saying, unless he's talking earlier about, he implied that what he meant by classical counting method is Leibniz's law. Well, Leibniz's law isn't a counting method, right? It's not telling you what things divide to things, like what's the principle of individuation between X and Y. It's just telling you if X and Y are identical, they share all the same properties, right? It's not telling me why, it's not telling me anything about the world in which would allow me to know why a tree is different from a car, right? It's not telling me the identity conditions of a tree, the identity conditions of a car, such that a tree is not a car or whatnot. That's not what it does, so I don't know why he's bringing that up. But let's address his mono-humanity point, and I've addressed this in my previous video. And it has to do with a disagreement about metaphysics. So under our view, or most of Christianity, we hold to divine simplicity. And if you hold to divine simplicity, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, God cannot be a universal that's instantiated, because universals in principle imply in their concept the potential to be instanced, the potential to be actualized. But God has no passive potential, so therefore God cannot be instanced. He cannot be an instance or multiply instantiated in principle, right? Because he has no passive potency. So there's just one metaphysical reason that stops us from counting three gods in the way that we would say a human being is universal, right? God is not a universal. Universals imply passive potency because in principle, in the concept, it includes the potential to be multiply instantiated, even if it is never multiply instantiated. But God in principle cannot be multiply instantiated, so therefore he cannot be universal, which means he cannot be a particular in the sense that a particular is an instance of some universal. So that completely breaks his point, and it gives the symmetry breaker that he was asking for.
So I know who I'm critiquing. Do you hold to impure relative identity?
Sorry?
Do you hold to impure relative identity?
No, I wouldn't be able to describe what that is.
Impure relative identity is that you have two sotus, under sotu being and sotu person, and under sotu being, any two reference that substantiate or fulfill a set of predicates found in a sotu are simply going to be identical to that sotu.
Well, I'll tell you what I believe, and then you can criticize it.
Yeah, but the thing is, it's very vague what you believe. But that's why, for example,
it's
there's Trinitarians that hold to RI only, those hold to impure relative identity only, and some hold to literally Leibniz's law, which is, I'm assuming what you affirm. So I need to know your position exactly.
Wow, this next clip is interesting. He says, he's asking Bob if you hold to impure relative identity. And he spoke so much gibberish, I had to write it down because I can't remember it. Like, these words don't coherently fit together. He says, impure relative identity is when you have two sortals, here sortal being and sortal person, and under sortal being and under sortal, and under sortal being, any two references that fulfill a set of predicates found in that sortal are going to be identical to that sortal. What is this guy talking about? I'm not just asking you. I have no clue. That's not what relative identity is. Relative identity is when you have someone who believes that the logical structure of identity is twofold, meaning in their language they have an unrestricted identity operator and it also allows a sortal indexed identity operator. Everything else he said is gibberish. Listen to the end of this. He says, and fulfill a set of predicates found in that sortal are going to be identical to that sortal. What? In relative identity in general, we don't believe that the persons are identical to the sortal itself. That's not what we believe. We believe that the persons are identical to an object under the sortal. They're not identical to the sortal itself. What does that even mean? I mean, this guy's just super confused about what he's saying. He then says, there are some who hold to relative identity, impure relative identity, and then he says there are some who hold to Leibniz's law. And the Leibniz's law that he's referring to, because historically, they're used to refer to three laws, he's talking about the indiscernibles of identity, which is that if X and Y are identical, then they share all the same predicates. Now, we agree with that, right? You can hold to relative identity and agree with that. The only difference is you take a different interpretation of the identity operator, the logical structure of identity. You don't disagree with the law. You just take a different interpretation of the identity operator. So you still hold to Leibniz's law. I mean, he doesn't know that, so he keeps saying stuff like this.